3. Enemy is unaware of our presence at this time, over. Solid copy. Hitman 2-3, Echo 5 Foxtrot. This is Hitman 2 actual.
Hey, good morning, everybody. This is Ben Powers coming at you from the Commander's Voice. My guest today is Mr. James Fenelon. He's a fantastic author who best known right now probably for his history of the 17th Airborne Division, 4 Hours of Fury, but he's got a great new book coming out, Angels Against the Sun, about the 11th Airborne Division in the Pacific. James, hey, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thanks. Good morning, Ben. I appreciate the opportunity.
So James has been on the show before. He's one of my early guests. I think he was my 7th episode, and this is going to be the 51st episode on the channel. So it's an exciting time. And as the channel has been growing, James has been writing. Obviously, is the book now out, James, or is it still kind of in pre-publication?
The book is available for pre-order. It comes out in 10 days on April 18th. So
that's awesome.
Yeah,
that's exciting. So James, just for folks who don't know, who haven't gone back and seen the previous interview, James is a former Army paratrooper, Pathfinder jump master. And the thing I love about him, we were talking before the interview, James seeks out the paratrooper stories that not everybody knows. Everybody knows Band of Brothers. Everybody knows 101st. 82nd, my alma mater, in my opinion, the premier airborne division in the Army. A lot of people love to read that stuff. Very few folks know about the 11th Airborne Division, and they're the guys who fought in the Pacific. So, James, if you could start us off with just what attracted you to their story.
Yeah, I think you kind of touched on it as, being a fellow paratrooper. There's a very rich history there, of course, which originated in World War II, which has kind of been my area of focus, obviously. And I think, there's a lot of well-known and deservedly so stories that come out of the 101st and the 82nd. They have a very rich legacy and history from World War II, well deserved. But there are also other airborne units from the war that had just as provocative and unique experiences. And I think that's one of the things that, I still remember the small, at the time, infantry museum that was on Fort Benning when I went through jump school back in '88. And I remember, and I may have told you this anecdote last time, so I apologize if I'm repeating, but in there they had the list of all the combat jumps in World War II, and the bottom of that list was the Rhine operation, which I had never heard of. And just, as I educated myself on our airborne history, it just struck me of how many great stories remain to be told. And so that's kind of what attracted me first to the 17th Airborne, and now more recently to the 11th, which is even less well known because the Pacific Theater, as a general topic, gets less coverage, and then the Army and the Pacific even less so than that.
So I want to kind of start with that and work our way backwards, because understand 100%, everybody thinks PTO, they're thinking Marine Corps, they're thinking Iwo Jima, they're thinking island hopping. And we're actually going to get to a small Iwo Jima connection, I think, later in this conversation, if it goes the direction I think it's going to go. But at the same time, during World War II, paratroopers were new. They were kind of the hotness, and they were big in the ETO. They were elite. They were exciting. Did you ever come across anything in your research why the Army did not seize more on the public relations opportunity of what this airborne division in the Pacific was doing to kind of show, hey, we're out here too?
Well, I think that's I'll give you a broader answer to that, because I think the answer applies to all of the Army units that were in the Pacific, quite frankly. I can't remember the numbers, but if you look at the communiques coming out of General MacArthur's headquarters about the progress and what was being done in the war under his command, right? There was 2 advances going across the Pacific, one under the command of Admiral Nimitz, and then one under General MacArthur. I think the statistic is something like 98% of General MacArthur's communiques and press releases just mentioned MacArthur, didn't mention any of the units that were actually under his command making progress. There certainly were small stories about the 11th Airborne in Stars and Stripes and in Yank magazine about their landing on Leyte and some of the things that they were doing further inland as they were trying to cross the island. But by and large, I think, there were 21 Army divisions in the Pacific Theater. The 11th, of course, was just one of those. There were 6 Marine divisions. And so, none of people would be hard pressed to name any of those 21 Army divisions in addition to the 11th. And I think just because of the way The campaign progressed, and the emphasis, obviously at the time on not broadcasting intelligence the Japanese could take advantage of potentially had a role in it. And then I just think also that MacArthur was preferred the limelight to be cast upon him rather than the guys on the ground.
No, that's fair. That's a really great assessment, actually, and I appreciate you breaking it out like that. So let's kind of take it back to the beginning a little bit from the standpoint of when airborne units are being stood up. I want to say, and obviously you're the author, so please correct me. The 11th Airborne Division gets stood up in 1943. Is this correct?
That's right, February of 43.
And so the were they stood up and they're starting to train and they do, I want to say they do the standard round of Toccoa, Benning, McCall. Did they know they were going to the Pacific? Were they training specifically for that theater, or were they just doing a standard Army training template at that time?
Yeah, interesting question. So they were stood up in February of 43 at Camp McCall. The 511th, which was their parachute infantry regiment, had already been established earlier in 1943. And so they kind of joined the 11th already as an organic unit, which caused some friction here and there. But then the entire division started doing basic training all together. So all of the glider infantry regiments, all the support units, all the artillery units were going through initial basic training, 8 weeks, 9 weeks, and then they went into their individual skills training. And to answer the short answer to your question is no, they did not know that they were training for the Pacific. When they started doing unit level training at Camp Polk, Louisiana, there started to be some suspicion that, oh, the reason we're here training in the swamps of Louisiana is that we're being prepared for the Pacific. But then there was another division on post who had just completed their unit level training and they got deployed to Europe. So those rumors, initially were accurate, but then they they started rethinking it. And it wasn't really until they boarded trains in Louisiana and those trains turned left, meaning they went west instead of right to the east, that they figured out that they were heading to the West Coast and therefore a port to be shipped out to the Pacific Theater.
Tracking. And so the leader of the 11th Airborne Division was Major General Joseph Swing. And if I remember correctly, he had come from the 82nd, where he had been the division artillery commander before he was appointed to command this element. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah, he was actually he joined the 82nd when it was an infantry division, and so went through that progress of transformation from an infantry division into an airborne division. It's interesting to note that when he first got to the 82nd Infantry Division, all of the artillery was still horse-drawn artillery at that point. So very,
Oh, wow.
Very short transition time there. And I think it kind of shows in a little example how rapidly the Army was transforming at the beginning of World War II, going from an infantry division with horse-drawn artillery and converting everything to an airborne capability.
So did Swing have enough time with the 82nd during and after the transformation that he had an airborne mindset when he took command, or was he kind of building his command organically, kind of the same way Ridgway had to deal with it? I mean, you got the 101st, you got Bill Lee comes in, he's Mr. Airborne, he kind of knows what he's all about, whereas Ridgway is figuring it out. What was Swing's mindset? Did he have enough airborne grounding at that point?
I think that's a fantastic question, because I think it's I found Swing's transition to be fascinating, because to your point, he actually made his first jump. As far as I can tell, the historical record shows he only made one jump with Ridgway when they did that initial. They went to Benning. General Miley put them through, the gentleman's course. They did, like a 5-hour orientation and then made their jump and got their wings. Swing was figuring it out organically. Now, he did have an advantage in that he went out to North Africa for a period of time, and after the 11th had been formed, while they were going through basic training, and he was a liaison / advisor to Eisenhower, who he knew very well, and kind of witnessed firsthand the near debacle of the Sicily drop. And so he brought back with him, when he got back to the United States and resumed command of the division, he brought back those lessons learned from Sicily, put a higher emphasis on night training, higher emphasis on assembly at night after an airborne operation, both from a glider perspective and parachute operation. But Swing, by and large, very much viewed airdrops as just simply a commute, a way to get to work. And it clashed heavily with this opinion, this attitude clashed heavily with the commander of his parachute infantry regiment, which was a guy named a colonel by the name of Orrin Haugen, who was very much of the airborne mindset. He had been a company commander in the 501st Parachute Infantry Battalion, the very first organized unit of paratroopers that the Army fielded. And he very much viewed jump school and the airborne as a rite of passage into an elite corps of warriors, if you will, that he was forging in his parachute regiment. And so one of the things that Swing brought back with him from his time watching what was going on in Sicily is he started a division level jump school so that he could get as many guys in the division jump qualified as possible, because he wanted the flexibility to be able to deploy his division, whether it was heavy on gliders or heavy on parachute operations. He wanted as many of the men qualified to jump as possible for two reasons. One, to give them that flexibility in combat, but also to raise the morale equally across the division, right? They had this, the paratroopers had their elite status with their jump wings and their jump boots and their egos and their attitudes, and which Swing detested that. And he wanted to provide the opportunity for the glider guys to volunteer and go through jump school. And so he ran a 5-day jump school through the division. Every post they went, they implemented a different version of that jump school, and got up to where I think it was around 85% of the enlisted men in the division were jump qualified in one way or another, whether they went through the school at Benning or through his smaller school.
That's awesome. And there's so much to unpack there. The first thing that I'm taking away from that is, despite his relatively advanced age, we're talking a division commander who's a contemporary of Eisenhower, a friend of Eisenhower. You'd think, oh, he's kind of old Army, he might be hidebound. But this he's thinking in very fresh terms, using a very new to the U.S. Army concept and doing things with it that show a higher level of flexibility than the younger guys, which is amazing. So that's the first thing that impresses me right off the bat. The second thing that I find interesting is that they're running a 5-day jump school, which tells me they probably already got the troops to a standard of fitness where all they had to worry about was technical proficiency. Because it pains me to say this, but if I'm being intellectually honest, there's nothing difficult about walking out of a door and falling. And right. All you get out of airborne school is a week of getting beat down, a week of doing something with so much repetition, you're going to do it no matter what, and then 5 jumps. It's really not that hard, but especially during World War II, when airborne school was truly a meat grinder, and it was all about physical fitness and getting these guys to that elite level conditioning. So apparently Swing felt he had his guys in good condition to be able to put them through a 5-day jump school.
Well, I think that's a great observation, and I don't disagree with you. Gravity does the vast majority of work when you step out of an airplane. But I think, and that's certainly a fair assessment. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And you touched on it. I think the critical part was back in World War II, jump school was almost equally a selection process as it was a training process, right? So certainly the end goal was to make your 5 jumps and become technically proficient in that. There was certainly a lot more hazing than there is currently, with that idea that those early units, those parachute infantry battalions, and then those independent regiments were gearing up almost like Ranger battalions back in the 80s, right, where there wasn't a regimental command structure and they were independent units and they were intended to be self-sufficient and go in. The parachute battalions and regiments back in World War II, initially they were viewed as shock troops to go blow up bridges, seize airfields, things of that nature. And so the grinder process going through jump school was very much part of their selection process, and to develop that mindset of you're made out of Kevlar, you have to be this strong, indicate if you have to build that elite status. To your point, Swing did feel like, okay, everybody in the division had just, finished 16 some odd weeks of basic training. They've done rucksack marches. They've been doing, calisthenics and PT every morning. They're in shape. They're already in the division. We need to emphasize less of the PT requirements and the hazing components and focus on the technical aspect. And he initially placed a cadre from the 511th in charge of running his jump school. And then he went down there one day to see how the training was going. And he did not, there was way too much emphasis on physical training and hazing. So he, called in Haugen, the commander, and was like, hey, focus on the technical stuff and just getting these guys qualified. They had a massive argument. Haugen refused to change his course of instruction. So he got fired basically from running the division jump school. And that then transitioned over to cadre from the 457th Parachute Field Artillery Battalion. Those guys who were already parachute qualified from Benning took over as cadre for the 5-day school.
Roger that. So you brought up something I had my next question teed up, but I'm going to table it for a second. Did Swing and Haugen ever reconcile, or did they have a problem all the way through?
It's a great, it's an interesting question. I mean, the historical record gets a little hazy on some of that because unfortunately Haugen, spoiler alert, Haugen was killed in action later in the war. So we never really got his side of things. I will say this, every opportunity that Swing had to put a unit on point, he put Haugen and the 511th on point. And so there was certainly a begrudging respect, and there was, and I go into this in the book on Leyte. They certainly had some disagreements on Leyte as well. But they also were both professional soldiers, right? And they both understood, I think they both understood the mission was bigger than their personal differences. And I think over time that they kind of started to see each other's kind of point of view, if you will. I mean, I think Swing started to really understand the benefit of having a regiment of these guys who had this, what he viewed as an attitude problem, because they never quit and they never gave up, under some horrific conditions in Pacific or on Leyte and Luzon. And I think Haugen, who was his classmates in West Point made several comments all consistently about how he despised discipline. And I don't think that Haugen despised discipline. I think he despised pointless discipline, which is something that the interwar army or an army not at war is usually really good at, right? Pointless discipline. And so I think
off the grass.
Yeah. And so I think, Haugen came to understand what Swing's mindset was on some of those things as well.
Tracking. So the question that I tabled, I want to come back to. So once you have 85% of your division jump qualified, back at a time when only, anywhere from 33 to 66% of the division is going to be on jump status because of the glider component, were guys who graduated from the division school not in the cool kids club because they didn't go to Benning, or did it matter? They were all airborne qualified and they were good to go?
Well, it's interesting you say that. They were certainly authorized to wear the paratrooper boots and the jump wings, and Swing actually has another move which I found fascinating. Changed the name of the glider infantry regiment. So as an example, the 188th Glider Infantry Regiment became internally referenced in the division as the 188th Paraglider Infantry Regiment, as a way to kind of recognize their dual qualifications. I think the best way to answer your question is that decades after the war, at 11th Airborne reunions, the 511th guys who went through Benning always talk smack to the guys who went through the 5-day course decades after the war. So I don't know that they were, they certainly were, again, technically proficient and knew what they were doing. I don't think the guys that went through Benning viewed them as part of the club, though.
I got you. Understood. That's kind of the answer I was expecting. So you've referenced that General Swing was Ike's airborne advisor, and that he was, there was a horrific combat debut of the Airborne Division in Sicily. And coming out of that experience, Ike is on record as saying, I don't believe in the Airborne Division. And these elements need to be restored to the concept of these independent strike forces for special operations, for lack of a better term. And swing was instrumental in kind of saving the airborne division. So could you talk a little bit about maybe the swing board and the Knollwood maneuver?
Sure. Yeah. So to your point, after Sicily, there was a lot of questions being asked around the doctrine and the ability to actually transport troops at night. And of course, at that point, they all had to be night drops due to the lack of air superiority in the theater, and that raised some questions. And the questions were to be settled in a massive exercise conducted in the United States, with the 11th Airborne Division as the proxy for the other airborne divisions. They were assigned a task. If I recall correctly, it was either I think it was three airfields that they were supposed to seize, and they were taking off from 5 airfields around the Tennessee area. And they actually flew a massively, I shouldn't say unnecessary, but they put the troop carrier pilots in a situation to fly at night on a route that simulated as much as possible the length of time of an airborne operation in the European theater. The idea was to not only drop troops and gliders on target, but then use aerial resupply to keep them sustained. And I think it was probably a week-long exercise. And at the end of it, the judges and the board that convened to review recognized that with enough training for air crew and all the support elements, that the division concept was sound, and that they needed to continue to refine their tactics and techniques and procedures.
So the results that come out of the Knollwood maneuver, the airborne division as a concept, good to go. We're going to keep fielding these organizations, and their combat success speaks for itself. Did the lessons learned that swings guys were accumulating and applying, did they make their way back to the more established airborne divisions? Like, did the 82nd Airborne care at all, other than the fact that it got to stay a division, what was coming out of the Knollwood maneuver? Or were they like, hey, we have our own combat lessons learned, we don't need to apply these TTPs because we know what works. We were in Sicily, we were in Italy. Well, how were the Knollwood lessons disseminated and adopted across the airborne community?
It's a great question. Frankly, I don't know that the other divisions knew that they were potentially on the chopping block. And I think the vast majority of the lessons learned applied more towards the Army Air Force than they did necessarily the airborne troops itself, right? So I think from the 11th Airborne perspective, when they were on that exercise, they were implementing current division level doctrine. And what really came into play in Sicily was, do we have the technical ability to find a point on a map in the dark and deliver, our combat power to this point in time where we need it? And I think that was the main lesson learned from the Knollwood maneuvers, is that yes, you can in fact, under the right conditions, deliver troops at night.
Tracking. And so what I find interesting and almost ironic, so we get through the Knollwood maneuver, these TTPs are established, these lessons are learned, and then almost promptly after going through this big ETO scenario, we ship the 11th Airborne Division off to the Pacific Theater, where conditions are vastly different. So I think this would be a good time to talk about that deployment. I know they had an acclimatization period and some additional advanced training, but what I really want to talk about is the deployment timeline, and then if we could just address the space in the Pacific Theater vice in the European theater, and how those vast differences really impacted the use of an airborne division.
Yeah, so to your point, they shipped out in May of 1944. They left the port in San Francisco. They went to New Guinea, which at the time had been largely secured by that offensive that we talked about earlier of MacArthur's troops moving through there. There was still a tiny section of New Guinea that was still under Japanese control, but they had been, largely isolated and were contained. And the 11th Airborne did not see any combat in New Guinea, even though I think they technically have the New Guinea campaign on their flyers, because it was an active combat zone. They were still fighting on New Guinea while they were there, but they spent their time focused on training. They had the benefit of working with some Australians who put them through some survival schools and jungle training. Some of the guys took advantage of the time that they were there, went through the Alamo Scout School. Swing set up another division level jump school there. And they also conducted a series of live fire exercises, which I think put them in a good position of developing their own lessons learned there of how to fight and maneuver in the jungle. Sadly, there were several guys that were killed in those live fire exercises, so we know from that they were probably realistic training exercises. And they started to, they were on New Guinea for so long, they started having a morale problem of the guys started, referring to themselves as logistics troops or, manual labor troops, because they were spending a lot of time unloading ships and supplies on the island. And it wasn't until November of 1944, so they were on New Guinea from May until November, training and trying to keep their morale high, and before they were deployed over to Leyte in the Philippines.
Roger. So you touched on the Alamo Scouts, which I find fascinating. I don't want to go down a rabbit trail on this, but for folks who don't know, if you're watching this channel, you probably do know. But folks who don't know, Alamo Scouts are Sixth Army's special reconnaissance organization, basically, and in Special Forces lineage, the Alamo Scouts are one of the precursors, and these guys were really behind the lines type folks. My question is, getting the guys from the 11th who had the opportunity to go through that training pipeline, was that a concept like, hey, let's send the guys from the intelligence and reconnaissance platoons with a concept that we're gonna have an organic behind the lines capability? Or was this just, hey, we're here from May to November, we got an opportunity to send some guys to this school, let's send them? Was it just an opportunity, or was there thought put behind it in how to develop the intelligence and reconnaissance capability of the division?
Yeah, no, it was definitely a conscious effort. So Henry Muller, who was the colonel in charge, he was the S2, the intelligence officer for the division, or the G2, I'm sorry. He had formed a provisional reconnaissance company that then was changed to a provisional reconnaissance platoon. And so this was, and a decisive effort to train guys specifically in scouting ahead. They were also, they had Pathfinder skills. And so they sent a handful of these guys from this temporary, provisional, meaning that it wasn't necessarily on the official TO&E. So they cherry picked guys and formed this, they went through a little selection process of an interview, and they formed this reconnaissance platoon, and they sent a handful of those guys specifically to the Alamo Scout School to then bring those skills back to the recon platoon.
That's awesome. Every step of the way, I get more and more impressed with General Swing, his staff, his commanders, because if you look at airborne history, there's almost an improvisational element to how different things occur, like, building it on the fly. And that seems to be notably absent in how Swing approached things. The level of rigor that, hey, this is an opportunity, let's build a capability, let's take advantage of these resources. Everything we've talked about thus far shows just some people would say, well, this is common sense, but common sense, as we know, sometimes does not thrive in a military organization. So the fact that this common sense is being applied and this level of mindfulness towards the mission is being applied is amazing to me.
Yeah, I agree. That was one of the things that, as I was doing the research, that I came to appreciate as well. Initially when you first start reading about Swing, the interwar years, he was, the Army's small. He was in that elite officer corps, very well connected. He married the daughter of the Army's chief of staff. He played polo, and you just kind of have this view of, a very stoic character, very politically connected. And but he came out of the corner swinging in World War II and really adapted his division to the conditions, and it was that balance between, I'm going to stick to doctrine until it doesn't make any sense, and then I'm going to do what I need to do to accomplish the mission. And it makes for a fascinating case study, in my opinion.
And that's an awesome setup, because you brought us all the way to November of 44. So we're going back to the Philippines and the big combat debut of the division. And they do some really interesting stuff. I'm going to steal your line that once these guys get to combat, they're really the way they operate. They're the most airborne of the airborne divisions, and I'm going to ask you to talk about their combat debut and then elaborate on that statement.
Yeah. So, initially, so the landings on Leyte took place started on October 20th, and the division was left out of the initial invasion. They landed administratively in the middle of November as a reserve unit. They had been left out because General MacArthur and his ground commander, Walter Kruger, felt that they were too small of a unit to sustain themselves in combat. So, one of the differences between airborne divisions and regular infantry divisions, of course, were the number of guys, the manpower. So Swing had around 8,500 guys in his division. A regular infantry division had anywhere between 14 and 15,000 head count. And so they're almost, just a little over half the size of a regular infantry division. And a lot of that, cost cutting came in the logistical support channels. And so MacArthur and Kruger were initially hesitant to commit the 11th. They didn't have a lot of extra logistics capability and support capability to spread around. But they sustained a lot more casualties than they had expected on Leyte. And so the 11th Airborne got tapped to move up into the central mountain range there. And initially their mission was to set up blocking positions. The Japanese were landing thousands of reinforcements on the west coast of Leyte. The Americans were on the east coast. In between was this massive, rugged central mountain range. And so they were going to move the 11th up again with the 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment on point there to set up blocking positions up in the mountains. And where the most airborne of the airborne comes into play, in my opinion, is that, if you compare the 11th campaign to Europe, you've got, of course, these massive airdrops in Normandy, Market Garden, the Rhine. And that, they used it as an airborne assault, if you will, right? Or, whereas Swing, again, with 85% of his guys airborne qualified and not having the ability, I think there were 6 or maybe 8 C-47s on the island of Leyte to support 5 or 6 divisions. And so getting a cargo aircraft, allocated to you for a resupply mission took a lot of effort. But what Swing did have was he had 7 organic observation aircraft that were attached to his artillery units. These are single engine, 2-seater aircraft. One of the guys described him as a lawnmower with wings. And so Swing begged, borrowed, and stealed some pilots and more aircraft. And eventually, I think he got up to about 14 of these light observation aircraft. And as the 511th was pushing their way up into the mountains, it had been raining on Leyte for over 30 days. There were no roads up into the mountains. There was no way to get a Jeep up there. There was no way to get their smaller artillery up there. Everything had to be carried on guys' backs. And so you're bringing in crates of sea rations. You're bringing in radio batteries, medical supplies. You're humping mortar shells up there. And so eventually they get to a point to where they create a small clearing for these observation aircraft to fly over and drop additional supplies as they're up in the mountains. And so what Swing does is he taps a platoon from his combat engineer unit and starts dropping them in one man at a time from these observation aircraft. So these guys are literally taking their static lines, wrapping them around the spars of the chair in the back seat of these planes, and then jumping out into the jungle. And so these engineers land with their equipment. They start slowly expanding that drop zone. And then to free the infantry that are already there, securing that drop zone, that resupply point, Swing then drops in an entire company from his glider infantry, one of his glider infantry units. Again, one guy at a time, flying in on these observation aircraft. And so you really see again, back to that point, that flexibility that he built by having his own jump schools, by leveraging the guys that were trained for jumping to resupply himself, to reinforce positions, to secure them, and then to free his other units to then continue the campaign across the island. And so from that perspective is where I say, you really see the 11th Airborne Division using their unique capabilities of an airborne division in a way you don't see anywhere else during the war.
So the two things I take away from that, well, three things. Number one, again, the flexibility and fertile mind of Joe Swing is fantastic. But additionally, I get Ord Wingate Chindit vibes without the crazy. And I also get which is pretty amazing. And I also get, though, we're seeing 20 years before Vietnam, we're seeing prototype air assault operations. If, like, we were, again, before the taping, we were having a conversation, if we replace observation aircraft and one jumper at a time with utility helicopters, I mean, this could easily be taking place in the Central Highlands of Vietnam. You come in, the engineers blast out some space, you expand the lodgement, you start reinforcing and bringing your capability in, and it's so Swing's ahead of his time. It's fascinating to hear.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that was, and we touched on before the recording as well about the concept of light infantry that the Army had embraced during the late 80s timeframe. And I think, again, there's a lot of those tenets that informed that doctrine could also be applied to the campaign.
So now that we're on the Philippines, we're on Leyte, and we've got the division is committed, even though it's only 8,500 troopers. At this point, though, I think they start to really show their value. I think you could arguably say the 11th Airborne Division punches above its weight for the entirety of the campaign. What were the highlights of the campaign on Leyte?
Yeah, well, there was, one of the, so as they initially set up those blocking positions, and then it was determined, they figured out that the Japanese were in fact, moving a sizable unit across attempting to move a sizable unit across those mountains. To get down into Leyte Valley, where the Japanese thought that there were some airfields that the Americans were using. And there were some airfields down there, but the rain had washed them out so badly that MacArthur had moved all of the land-based aircraft that he had further north. And Swing was using those airfields that had been largely turned into swamp for his light observation aircraft, right? So you couldn't land P-38s or anything like that on those fields, but you could land those observation aircraft because they were light. So as they're moving up into the mountains, they're getting higher and higher. I think the top elevation was close to something like 3,000 feet, which again put that logistical burden on there, because even at that point, you're flying aircraft up there, but the mountains at that point are now pretty much covered in clouds the entire time. So it became very dangerous for these light observation aircraft to try to fly through the clouds in this rugged, with these rugged peaks. And so right as they're about trying to figure out how to get this logistical situation sorted out, the Japanese actually launch a surprise airborne assault on those airfields that Swing was using for his light observation aircraft. And so, pretty interesting story that you have an airborne unit jumping into and attack another airborne unit. And so, and the original intention behind the Japanese operation was that they were going to link up with these troops that had come across the mountain range. They were going to airdrop in, and they were going to seize those airfields as an attempt to regain the offense on Leyte. Now, Haugen's men, the 511th up in the mountains, had been cutting the Japanese to shreds up there. There were several handful of the guys made it through the mountains to attack some of those airfields on the ground, simultaneous with the Japanese paratroopers jumping in to seize the airfields as well. Several of the Japanese aircraft were shot down before the guys could jump out of them. I think there was probably around 300 paras that ended up landing on the ground, but they became a major thorn in the logistical chain, because they just barricaded themselves in there, refused to surrender, ended up burning or destroying all but one of the observation aircraft. So like I said, Swing had amassed about 14 of them, and the after action reports indicate they had one that was flyable after the Japanese attack, which then put the burden on the guys in the field who went 5 days without any food while they were trying to sort out what was going on. And it took almost took those 5 days to push the Japanese off of the airfields and regain some kind of logistical control back down in Leyte Valley while the guys were still fighting up in the hills. And I think that's one of the more interesting highlights from the Leyte campaign, this Japanese air assault that took place.
That's absolutely amazing. 5 days without food, because anybody, sitting in comfort in, Central Texas, say, hey, you're gonna go for the next, 120 hours without eating. You're like, wow, that's gonna suck. And so these guys have been in combat on minimal calories. Now they're getting nothing, but they're still fighting. The environment itself is sapping calories. Being on alert, being scared, being psyched up saps calories. I can only imagine what it was like on that, on that 5th day when they were dealing with that. It's interesting because I get kind of a Lions of Carentan vibe, the 101st against the Fallschirmjäger in Carentan, but this has that added element of these guys jump directly onto the objective. This is probably the most airborne fight in the war, which is real, and it doesn't get much press. It's amazing to me, and I don't know, again, because the Pacific, just people don't dig into it the way they do the European theater. But I really appreciate the fact that you're highlighting this, really interesting piece of the war. It's and Japanese soldiers had a deservedly well-earned reputation for being ferocious anyway. I don't know if they had the same cachet of being an airborne guy that you had in the Allied armies, but if they did, if you take that baseline of a tough trooper and add that airborne level, I can only imagine what they were like as individual opponents.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they would, they have those, I can't remember the name of the trees. They're kind of like cypress trees, but they had these huge trees on Leyte with these massive roots that kind of came, up the tree. And these guys would just back into these trees with their machine guns and just, put themselves in a position where even if they wanted to, they couldn't withdraw. And so it took a lot of effort to really get in there. And plus, Swing had started moving all of his infantry, up into the mountains. So as the 511th was cutting across, he started feeding in his glider infantry units that were coming in. Some of them were dropping in one at a time. Some of them, some of the units were marching up to, again, seize those areas and then expand and deal with any of the Japanese that had been bypassed in there. So the troops really left behind to deal with this Japanese parachute incursion were the support troops, artillery units. They did move up. I think it was the 149th Infantry Regiment, which was a friendly, and another American regiment that had landed on the beach. So those guys landed and were issued ammunition, and pushed up into the fight for their that was their first combat experience, was going in and trying to figure out where these Japanese guys were.
Tough debut.
Yeah, tough debut.
It's amazing. So after Leyte, I don't want to say, oh, well, this happens and then Leyte's done, but after Leyte's secured, the next phase in the operation for the 11th is to go to Lausanne. Is that correct?
That's right. So MacArthur, had a desire to liberate Manila. He, obviously he was fulfilling his promise to the Philippine people of I shall return, and that manifested itself firstly on Leyte. But the true prize on it within the Philippines was Luzon, the main island, which was home to the capital city, which had a population at the time of around 800,000 people. He had landed his main force north of Manila and became pretty disgruntled very quickly with the slowness of the campaign to get to the capital city. And so he tapped his 8th Army commander, General Eichelberger, to come up with a secondary landing. To initially, it was hoped that it would withdraw Japanese forces south away from the defensive line that they had established north of the city. And so 8th Army was tapped with that mission. Basically, 8th Army consisted of just the 8th Army staff, the 11th Airborne Division, and a couple of support units. Swing had advocated that the unit be dropped in, the 11th be dropped in mass as a division drop near Manila. They just didn't have the aircraft to support that, nor did they really have the naval craft to support landing the division in its entirety. And so, again, we see Swing here getting creative with his deployment. He called it, he admitted, well, half a loaf is better than nothing. So he convinced Eichelberger, and Eichelberger supported the operation which was officially labeled as a reconnaissance in force, to land the 2 glider infantry regiments amphibiously, and then drop the 511th further inland to link up with the glider infantry inland, and then shoot north up to attack Manila.
So Eichelberger is a pretty interesting guy as well, and I think, as you pointed out earlier, you know, in MacArthur's theater, it's all about MacArthur. You're not going to hear about a subordinate commander or a subordinate element. But Eichelberger was a very creative guy at the operational level, and I think had he not served under MacArthur, we would have heard a lot more about him. And how did he get along with Swing?
They got along like peas in a pod. I've read letters from both of them, period letters written back to their wives, and they both had a lot of admiration for each other. They were very much of the same mindset. To your point, Eichelberger, I think, is another one of the overlooked heroes of World War II. MacArthur kind of quashed his he was nominated for the Medal of Honor for his work on New Guinea. Basically, Eichelberger was almost, single-handedly responsible from a leadership perspective of getting that campaign back on track. He was also going to be tapped to potentially go to the ETO and serve as an Army commander there. MacArthur allegedly prevented that from happening. So MacArthur both knew that he had some talent there, but also didn't want him to outshine himself, right? And so when the 11th, when Swing was attached to the 8th Army, when those guys landed, so Swing came ashore with the amphibious element. I think he was in the 3rd wave with the glider guys as they came ashore. He set up his headquarters in a nearby village there. Eichelberger came ashore later that afternoon. They conferred, started pushing their troops further east to where the 511th was going to drop. But there are plenty of pictures of both Swing and Eichelberger up front with the vanguard of the element as they were making their way towards Manila. There's pictures of Eichelberger talking to guys from the 511th in their reconnaissance jeeps making their way north. So they were very much, both of them were very hands-on, both of them were very aggressive, and both of them definitely believed that an aggressive offense would be the best way to keep the Japanese off balance.
No, that's amazing. It cracks me up because I'm thinking about, you get 8th Army, you think an Army headquarters, and he's got, like you say, he's got an airborne division with 8 airplanes and some support elements. That's not even a corps. And this is supposedly an Army headquarters, and to me that speaks, in all seriousness, as a professional, it speaks to me about constrained resources in a huge theater. But it also makes me wonder, okay, just how starving was MacArthur keeping Eichelberger? I'm going to give you enough to get the mission done, but I'm not going to give you enough to make any spectacular moves. And when you're dealing with MacArthur, you got to wonder if that was part of his motivation or not.
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of speculation that part of his motivation was that he wanted to. So as I mentioned, he was frustrated with the slowness of the campaign coming down from the north. That campaign was under the command of Walter Kruger, again, his 6th Army commander. There was lots of speculation that perhaps MacArthur authorized this secondary landing as a way to drive some competitive spirit into 6th Army and to get them to move faster, because what ended up happening was, and this is explicitly found in the period documentation written both by Swing and Eichelberger, there was a competition to see who was going to be the first into Manila, 8th Army or 6th Army. And there was some raging debate on that, whether or not the 1st Cav got into Manila proper before the 11th Airborne Division did. Swing maintained until the day he died that they beat the 1st Cav into Manila. 1st Cav got the press release out first, so they took ownership or credit for that. But both, and again, I think when you asked about how well Swing and Eichelberger got along, I think again both of them admitted that they were raring to go and wanted to get into Manila first. It's worth noting that. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, please, James.
I was going to say, it's worth noting that MacArthur had sincerely hoped and believed that the Japanese were going to abandon Manila, declared an open city like he did in 1942. And for those of you listening, that just means that you're going to declare it an open city like the Germans did with Paris. You're going to pull your troops out so that there's no fighting in the urban area. Because like I said, there was over 800,000 civilians in Manila. And so fighting in that dense urban environment was not going to be a win for anybody. But unfortunately, the convoluted Japanese chain of command resulted in the Japanese Navy and their sailors and their equivalent of the Marines staying and barricading themselves in Manila, and it became the largest urban combat in the Pacific theater.
And that's precisely what I was going to ask. Manila became a real slugfest. I mean, it's not a Stalingrad, but as you said, the largest urban combat in the Pacific, and it's certainly on the short list of horrific urban fights in World War II.
Yeah, absolutely. When the Japanese had been preparing, they knew that the Americans were going to attack the Philippines. They knew that they were going to land on Luzon. I mean, just as a military assumption. They had built the predominant defenses for Manila along the southern area. They figured that MacArthur was going to land to the south of the city. He didn't. He landed from the north, but that southern belt of defenses, which was referred to as the Genko Line, was what the 11th Airborne Division ran into as they were moving their way north into the city. And it's a sad fact, but over 100,000, an estimated 100,000 civilians were killed in the battle for Manila because the Japanese would barricade themselves in these buildings. They refused to give up, refused to surrender. And the only way to get them to stop fighting was to either go in after them or bring the building down around them. And, the Americans opted to bring the buildings down around them in most cases.
That's horrific. I mean, over 10% civilian casualties. You can't put a good face on that in any way, shape, or form. So that's just a shame. But you've mentioned the Genko Line, so to go to something that might be a little more uplifting, this is the point in time where we kind of get into, for lack of a better term, almost the legend of the 11th Airborne Division, because when they were on the Genko Line, they got their warning order for probably their most famous achievement during the war, which obviously is the Los Baños raid. So could you talk to us about that a little bit?
Yeah. So when the Japanese took the Philippines in 1942, as you can imagine, there were lots of foreign nationals there, meaning that there were American civilians there that were contractors for the Navy. They're running businesses, nurses. There was British, Australian, French civilians that were there as well. And so the Japanese rounded up these foreign nationals and put them in a number of internment camps. Several of those were in Manila and had been, those internees had been freed as part of the liberation of Manila. There was another camp holding just over 2,000 internees further south, southeast of Manila at a place called Los Baños. And as soon as the Genko Line had more or less been subdued, there was still plenty of fighting going on in Manila, but they had broken through that first line of major defense. To your point, Swing got a warning order that MacArthur wanted him to go rescue these internees. There was significant fears, and Filipino guerrillas had reported that it looked like the Japanese were potentially going to slaughter all of the internees rather than let them go or take them with them when they were being pushed further across the island by the Americans. And so there was a sense of urgency around rescuing these internees before anything could happen to them. And so Swing, and this kind of goes back to that point in the conversation we were talking about the Alamo Scouts and the reconnaissance platoon. So the first course of action was to send the reconnaissance platoon with several dozen guerrillas back to camp, back to the, no, I shouldn't say back, but to the internee camp to conduct a reconnaissance of that site. And they also served, and this didn't really become clear until I started reading some of the after action reports. It was a great example of a contingency plan. The guerrillas were actually authorized and encouraged to initiate on offensive action if the Japanese started to slaughter the internees, right? So that was kind of your first, your contingency plan was, okay, well, let's get the camp surrounded. Let's put eyes on it. Let's start seeing what's going on. And if something happens, we've at least got some guys in there that can rush in and do what they can to to rescue the
do that.
internees, while they then built up a more thorough reconnaissance plan. And that plan ended up eventually being that a ground assault was launched in the morning, simultaneous with the Japanese guards conducting their calisthenics exercise. So the vast majority of the guards were out in a field unarmed, and the only guards, were still around the camp that were armed. So the initial ground assault was the reconnaissance teams with guerrilla support, and that was initiated by a company of parachute infantry jumping out simultaneously into a nearby drop zone. The guy leaving the aircraft, the first jumper out of the door, was the signal for the ground assault to begin. So it was a simultaneous effort there. And then while that was going on, amphibious craft were chugging across the lake in Amtraks to then provide the evacuation force after the raid was completed.
So I got to ask, given all the constraints on aircraft that we were talking about, so for the 11th Airborne Division, a company-sized drop is almost like a mass tack. How did they get the aircraft they needed in order to be able to pull this off?
Yeah, they had for that jump that we talked about down south of Manila, they had scraped together 30 odd aircraft for that. They had 30 odd 40 C-47s, and I think they used 9 of those for the Los Banos jump. And so, they could muster those aircraft when they had them. And also, the airfields on Luzon were bigger, and they weren't buried under swampland like they were on Leyte. So you actually had more room for them to land. I think part of the problem on Leyte was the available airfields were taken up by tactical aircraft, right? Your P-38s and whatnot to provide air support, as opposed to, again, that logistical thing, which was getting, second, coming in lower priority than the tactical situation, right, was allowing.
Roger. And then obviously when you've got, the commanding general, General MacArthur, indicating this is a priority mission, it's probably a little bit easier to get the resources you want as well.
Absolutely right. Yeah.
So 2 things that struck me when I was reading the section on Los Banos, which I found very interesting. One was the surprising, for lack of a better term, lethargy among some of the prisoners to being liberated. You've got to take into account, okay, they've been in prison for 2-3+ years, and they're emaciated. They don't have a lot of calories. They don't have a lot of energy. So I can understand moving slowly, but it seemed like from the narrative that a lot of them were just kind of like, yeah, we're good. We don't want to go, and it was interesting that the tactic that they came upon the liberators were, during the firefight, some of the buildings caught fire, and that got the people who are occupying those places moving. So let's just torch the whole camp. I found that to be I never would have thought that would be a tactic, but it seemed to be surprisingly effective. How was that received in retrospect? Was that just like, hey, that's a good way to go? Or is that like, you guys really endangered a lot of people. Maybe that wasn't the right way to go.
Yeah, no, I think it was recognized as the motivating factor that it was, and it's a good, interesting observation you've made there. I would have to suspect that there was a little bit of Stockholm syndrome going on, to your point. They'd been in this camp for, several years. Essentially everything they owned was in that camp, and that I'm not saying that was much, but it was, a lot of them were hesitant because, like, well, I need to go back and get my suitcase, or I need to go find my, there's one woman, I wrote about this in the book, who wasn't going to leave without her cat. And so I think there was just that, and then part of it too was just, the suddenness of it, if you will, right? That morning you're literally getting ready to go out to do your daily roll call, and all of a sudden, these guys are crashing through the gates, shooting the guards. There's, grenades going off. And then all of a sudden, you're being told, hey, get your crap and get on the Amtrak. And so, I think that was part of it as well. There was just this, and then there was also confusion of none of the internees understood that, hey, this is a raid. We're here to get you and leave. Like, it's not the cavalry is not coming, because they were still, I think at that point, like 23, 25 miles behind where the front lines were. And so I think there was some of that confusion was, we're not here to stay. We're here to get you and move out.
That's a really good point. Your average civilian, when you say, hey, it's a raid, they're not going to know that implies a planned withdrawal. That's a really good point.
Yeah. Yeah, and so to your point, I think, lighting the barracks on fire certainly got people to move.
The probably my absolute favorite part of the book is when you wrote about Los Banos, but my absolute favorite statement was the woman who had a premonition that they were going to be rescued, but in her premonition they were going to be Marines, and she was absolutely disgusted that these guys weren't Marine.
Yes, yes, and you can imagine these paratroopers who were told of her disappointment when she said, "Well, you're not Marines. In all my dreams, I've been rescued by Marines."
That says everything you need to know about the PTO in one sentence, man.
That's right, absolutely right.
The thing I also found most interesting, my second favorite part was right after this, and I, I apologize because I didn't take a good note on this, but one of the soldiers, they execute the mission, and it's a big deal, but it's overshadowed by the fact that the Iwo Jima battle is going on simultaneously, and this takes place at the same time of the raising of the flag on Mount Suribachi, which is all over the press.
That's right.
And but the thing that I took away from that was I want to say it was one of the infantry NCOs who said, "Hey, we're a first class unit. We do a tough mission. We did it well, and now we're going to move on to the next objective." It wasn't like any resentment towards that, at least not overtly.
Right.
Just like, "Hey, this was the mission of the day, and now we're going to go take the next objective." And I thought that the ethos of the 11th Airborne Division comes out in that statement.
Yeah, I agree. And it's interesting because to your point, it was an amazing feat of arms. It was, one of the most, if not the most successful raid of the war. None of the internees, there was a couple internees that were wounded, but nobody was killed in the crossfire. They got all 2,000 out of them out. 2 Filipino guerrillas, unfortunately, were killed in the firefight. A couple of the Americans were wounded during the raid, but everybody else, they all left intact. And so, but it's also, from a division perspective, the raid itself was conducted by a battalion, right? A battalion and the reconnaissance platoon. The most of that battalion came in on the Amtraks, right? And they set up flank security and all that kind of stuff. But the rest of the division probably didn't even know what was going on, right? They're still out in the field. They're still out, engaging with the Japanese, trying to move those front lines forward. There was a diversionary attack by some of the glider battalions. But then the next day, it's back to business as usual. They've got their warning orders, and we're moving off in a different direction.
So after Luzon falls, that's kind of the third act of the division as far as combat's concerned. If there's not another huge campaign after this for them, is there?
Well, it's interesting. They did do a pretty massive swing south and cut across Luzon. So to your point, Luzon is their final kind of big hurrah, but there was a lot more fighting that took place to kind of cut across southern Luzon after that Los Banos raid. They moved down south, parallel with the first Cav was on their flank, and did conduct a lot more battles down around those areas for hilltops and mountain ranges that were occupied by Japanese forces.
Roger that. So where does the end of the war find the 11th Airborne Division?
The end of the war finds the 11th Airborne right smack outside of Tokyo. And so this is where the size of the division finally comes in on its favor, in that the atomic bombs were dropped. And contrary to popular misconceptions, the Japanese did not immediately surrender after the second bomb was dropped. There was a lot of internal debate going on in the hierarchy of the Japanese Empire, and I go into a little bit of that in the book, just enough to give context as to what was going on. But it took them several days to then announce that they were interested in talking about surrender, and then there was several weeks where the terms of the surrender were established. And during that time, the 11th Airborne was being airlifted first to Okinawa, where they staged out of Okinawa. They did some interesting experiments there of jumping out of B-24s. Swing was raring to get into Tokyo and had sent communiques back to Manila, back to his buddy Eichelberger, whose 8th Army was responsible for the initial landing of Army occupation troops, and said, "Hey, I've got guys ready to go. We figured out how to jump out of these B-24s. Let me go jump in to Tokyo." And Eichelberger was, there's political considerations. The Army can't get there first. We have to land simultaneously with the Marines, and so there was some political machinations going on there as well. As you can imagine, everybody's been fighting in the Pacific for years. Everybody wants a piece of the pie. They've all think they've earned it, and frankly, they had. But the 11th Airborne flew in a couple of days before the formal surrender ceremony and occupied an air base right outside of Tokyo, and they secured that area there. They did go in fully armed, fully combat loaded. Fortunately, there was no trouble there, but all the guys, all the troopers thought for sure it was an elaborate trap, and then one of them made the observation after being on the ground for a day or two. He said something like, the Japanese surrendered as hard as they fought. And
wow.
So it was kind of an interesting observation. And so that was the airfield that MacArthur landed on when he got there. And then a couple of days later, they had the formal surrender ceremony on the USS Missouri.
Oh, and there it is, from soup to nuts for the 11th Airborne Division of World War II. Kind of final thoughts, though. I've saved this one for last, and if I put you on the spot, I apologize. But every modern United States Army paratrooper has had their boots on Fryer Field. So could you tell us a little bit about who Fryer actually was, and the how Fryer Field drop zone being named after him is actually a amazing tribute to the Airborne Division?
Yeah, that's a great point. I appreciate you bringing that up, actually. So Elmer Fryer was, I think first and foremost, it's fair to describe him as a professional soldier. He had done a previous tour in the Army prior to World War II. He had also been a Marine for a short period of time. He was in the 11th Airborne. Specifically, he was in the 511th as a paratrooper. He was older than average, so I think he was in his early 30s at the time when the average age was 19. At a maximum, he was in his late 20s, and I apologize for I don't remember his age exactly, but he was older than the average guy in the unit. And it was in the early part of the Leyte campaign where, frankly, the 11th was still kind of developing a healthy respect for the speed at which Japanese forces could counterattack. You can say a lot of things about the Japanese, but they moved very quickly in the jungle, and they were quick to recognize an opportunity to counterattack. And basically what happened was Fryer's unit was moving forward. They had been engaged on three sides right before dark. The next morning, they realized that the Japanese had been moving around to try to cut them off. They started to conduct a fighting withdrawal. And as they were pulling back, Fryer stayed in position to direct fire from his machine gun teams, and also was engaging with his own, he had an M1 Garand. And I think later they credited him with almost taking out an entire Japanese platoon by himself. I think he was directly responsible for 20 some odd bodies that were found in front of his position, and then directing the fire support on either side of him with the machine guns. He ran outside the lines. There was a guy that near him that was wounded by a hand grenade, who had shrapnel in his face and couldn't see, and he started stumbling outside of the lines in the wrong direction, looking for medical help. Fryer ran out, grabbed him, brought him back into the line, was helping him back, and he was pretty much the end point of the fighting withdrawal. And he was pushing guys forward, bringing guys up, simultaneous with taking a knee and trying to stave off the Japanese who were advancing. His final act was, as they were moving forward, he was with a lieutenant who was also back there with him in the rear guard. A Japanese soldier jumped out of the undergrowth to shoot the lieutenant. Fryer threw himself in front of the lieutenant to take the burst, and then his final act before dying was to throw a hand grenade and take out the Japanese soldier. So he was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously on Leyte.
And that's just an amazing legacy, and that's why I can't think of a better paratrooper for the drop zone at Airborne School to be named after. That's just a fantastic legacy, and that recounting of what he did as a professional soldier, literally dying for his comrades, it's almost a cliche to say that's the combat motivation. You might you might enlist out of patriotism, but you fight for your fellow troopers, and that's embodied by Elmer Fryer's actions on Leyte. And that litany of things you listed off, any one of them is deserving of a Valor Award. But the fact that he had that sustained performance is just outstanding, and I think that's a fantastic note to end the discussion on. So James, I want to thank you very much for coming back on the show. This has been a fantastic conversation. Everybody, this is author James Fenelon. The book is Angels Against the Sun. You can pre-order it right now wherever you buy your history books, and it'll be in your winging its way to your mailbox soon. So, James, thank you very much for coming out on the Commander's Voice today.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, Ben. I appreciate the opportunity to speak about the 11th.
All right, thank you very much, sir.